Today we're doing section 4.5 day 1, and we're going to get into the basics of graphing, and we're going to be focusing specifically on the sine wave today. So for graphing sine, the basic equation looks like this: y equals a times sine times the quantity of bx minus c plus d. All right, so all of these values, a, b, and c, serve different purposes. So some different values that we find are the amplitude. And amplitude is the height of the wave, and that is always our a value. Our starting point is exactly what it's called. It's where the wave begins. And the way we find the starting point is c divided by b. The period is the distance for one wave to be completed, and the way we find that is 2 pi over b. And then the next thing we calculate is the period over 4, and this is going to be the distance between the x values. So there's 5 specific x values that we find. Our x1 value is always going to be your starting point. So whatever you get for your starting point is our x1 value. To find the x2 value, you take the x1 value and you add whatever you got from the period over 4. And you're just going to continue this pattern for the remaining 3 values. One thing that is important to jot down is that x1 is always going to be an x-intercept for the sine wave. So will x3, and so will x5. So sine starts and ends on an x-intercept. x2 is either a max or a min, and that depends on the amplitude, which means x4 would be a min or a max. So you did a little bit of the graphing last year in Algebra 2. This year we're just going to get a little bit more into detail when we are making our functions. So here we have a basic y equals sine x. So to kind of interpret this, my a value is 1. The b value is always in front of x. And because there's nothing being subtracted, our c value would be 0. So our amplitude is our a value, so the amplitude is just 1. The starting point will be c over b. So in this case, it'll be 0 over 1. So our starting point is 0. Our period is 2 pi over our b value. So in this instance, our b value is 1. So the period is 2 pi. And then we find 2 pi over 4, which is our period over 4. So the distance between each x value will be pi over 2, because we can reduce that 2 over 4. So remember, our x1 value is always our starting point. So my starting point is 0. And now I'm adding whatever my period over 4 is. So 0 plus pi over 2 will just be pi over 2. Now for x3, I'm going to take my x2 value, which is pi over 2, and add another pi over 2, which will be 2 pi over 2, which would just be pi. x4 would be that 2 pi over 2 plus another pi over 2. So x4 will be 3 pi over 2. And again, you're welcome to do these calculations in your head. You don't have to write it all out. x5 would be 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 2, which would be 4 pi over 2, which is 2 pi. So the distance from one wave, so the distance from x1 to x5 will always be the period. So now I need to get all this information translated onto a graph. So my x1 value is at 0, and because it's a sine wave, we're starting on an x-intercept. So the origin is going to be our first dot. Then our next value is at pi over 2. Because my amplitude is a positive 1, it will be up at a max. My x3 value is pi, and that's back to an intercept. My x4 value is 3 pi over 2, and now because I already hit the max, it means I'm going to the minimum of -1, and 2 pi would continue back to the intercept. If I wanted to keep going, if I wanted to make 2 periods worth, I would just keep going with this pattern. So that means 5 pi over 2 would be at a max, and 3 pi would be over here, back at an intercept. So we're going to go ahead and connect our dots to make our sine wave. We put arrows on both ends because this will continue to grow. Our domain is going to continue forever left and right. So our domain, that was bad, is -infinity to +infinity. However, our range is limited. It's not going to keep going forever. My range is going to bounce or oscillate up and down between -1 and 1. So notice as soon as it hits the max of 1, it travels back down. Then when it hits the minimum of -1, it travels back up, and it will continue in that pattern. So we're going to do a lot more practice on this tomorrow, so please make sure you are ready with questions.